the June 1st, 2023 Planning Commission meeting regarding the deliberation and vote for City Council Bill 22-0285, the Abundant Housing Act. My name is Sean Davis. I have the pleasure of chairing this commission. I'll turn it over to Chris Ryer, who I believe is on Fayette Street, to call roll. Director Ryer.
Robin Allen.
Present.
Liz Kuhn.
Present.
Marcia Collins.
Here.
The Honorable Eric Costello is not here today. Talib Horn.
Present.
Tom Previs.
Present.
Eric Stevenson.
Present.
And Sean Davis.
Present. So a little background on May 18th, the Planning Commission held a public hearing regarding the act. We had about 4 hours worth of presentations and public comment. At the end of the public comment, we closed the public hearing part of this process. And we decided that it would be best if we were given a little bit of an opportunity to think about all that we had heard and come back. And this is the continuation of that. There will be no public comment as part of this. It's strictly going to be the Planning Commission's deliberations and consideration, in hopes that we would be able to reach consensus on a recommendation to make to Baltimore City Council. And please also recognize that we are strictly a recommending body. The council is free to do take our advice, not take our advice, whatever they choose to do. So with that, what I would like to do is I'd like to turn it over first to Eric Tiso to give us at the end of our hearing, or during our hearing on the 18th, we were asking for maybe a little bit of additional information regarding any urban renewal plans that may restrict single family conversion. So I'd like to turn it over to Eric, and then we'll come back, and I'm going to turn it over to each commissioner to talk if they want to, if they have something to say about their thoughts and whatnot. And then after everyone's had an opportunity to chat, then hopefully we'll move to a recommendation. So Mr. Tiso, and of course I forgot to tell you I'm starting, so hopefully you were able to press record. I knew I was going to do it. Mr. Tiso.
Yep, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Good afternoon. And Director Ryer, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we asked all of our community planners to take a look at all the urban renewal plans in their area to see if there were any particular concerns. And I don't believe we heard of any that were. The one that we thought might be Coldstream Homestead Montebello, turns out that it does not have any impact. However, some years ago, there was some changes in zoning to move some parts of the neighborhood to R6, which functionally prohibits conversions under today's zoning code. So there might have been conflating of those ideas, but I don't believe that there are any that we're aware of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tiso. Are there any questions from the commission for Eric? All right, seeing none, I'd like to turn it over to Robin. Robin, if you have anything you'd like to say or discuss, please do.
As I've indicated to my fellow commissioners, I have a little bit of background on this going back 25 years, a little more than 25 years. So this issue has come up before on a smaller scale in the community of Ashburton. They were seeking to do the opposite of this to ensure that the community remains stable from their point of view. So I came into this with that information in mind prior to our previous meeting. Had not made up my mind, but that was my background on it. Since hearing the testimony, I did come away convinced towards the end once we heard, I think it was from Charlie Duff. I don't want to give credit or miscredit, but whoever it was towards the end that suggested that we do the 2-unit conversion by right and make anything above that go through the further requirements. I'm in favor of that. So that's it.
Great, thank you very much, Robin. Any questions for Robin from the commission? Okay, Liz, any thoughts from your perspective?
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. Mostly sort of Justin and I were able to discuss this before he left, and I wasn't able to stay for, in full disclosure, he was there the last time, as you guys know. But generally the goal of the mayor's office is to promote good policy, and also as a practical matter, though, here to get to the point where we'd like to get to the point where the planning commission can recommend something with amendments instead of recommending disapproval totally. So, and acknowledging that we're sympathetic to the concerns raised during the last hearing, but that we want to, get to a more amenable option, and that we think that, some of these things are political decisions that can be hashed out by the council as they further consider this bill.
Thank you very much, Liz. Commissioner Collins, I'm sorry, are there any questions for Commissioner Coons? Commissioner Collins, any thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a very thoughtful hearing that we had, and I really appreciated all of the comments and thought that people put into their responses. I felt like whether people were in favor or opposed or had mixed feelings, it was obvious that everyone had given it a lot of thought. Just based on the number of conversion bills we see before this committee, it seems to me that we need to look at this in a very sensible way. Right now, it has to go through an ordinance process. It's a lot of times it's influenced by whether the community likes the person or doesn't like the person, or feels things are well thought out or not thought out. But there is not a lot of consistency, I think, in a lot of these decisions, even though we have to look at the facts and try to be as fair-minded as possible. So I felt that much as Robin expressed the concept of having an additional unit by right and making the others more challenging, beyond that, more challenging to get, has an interesting aspect, and it would be applied across the board. And I think that's worth consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Are there any questions for Commissioner Collins from the commission? Okay, Commissioner Horn, I know you weren't present, but I believe you had an opportunity to review the video from that, incredible video, I'm sure, from our last hearing. So I just offer you the opportunity to present any thoughts that you may have.
Again, I wasn't present, but I did listen to about an hour, 45-minute video, and then also read the staff reports and also read the letters of support going both ways. I think I tend to agree with Robin and also Commissioner Collins. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to be very short with this only because I wasn't in person, and so I want to be fair in terms of the way I'm looking at this. But in listening to both of them and Charlie Duff, I think that might be the way that I'm leaning towards in terms of a compromise.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Horn. Commissioner Peep, any questions for Talib? Okay, Commissioner Priebus.
Yeah, I appreciated before and continue to appreciate Councilman Dorsey bringing forth a proposal that would change the status quo and in a way that would be equitable across the whole city. In particular, I felt that the decision one way or another to either permit or not permit or I guess in some ways have a procedure if we're going to have a conditional use whereby it is an administrative review that's called for by the Court of Appeals. Those two things were the things I like, and then that would apply across the city. Whereas right now we have a piecemeal conditional by ordinance approach to these residential units. And I think that's unworkable because it gives council people a veto authority that they shouldn't otherwise have under the law. So with that said, and I think the proposal, something similar to what Charlie Duff proposed that would apply equitably, including a permitted use at maybe one unit and then a conditional use, a traditional conditional use, maybe with board approval and all the laws and administrative rights that go with that, under Maryland law would be something I could support. And I think I think that would be a really strong approach going forward. And again, appreciate Councilman Dorsey for bringing this issue to the forefront. And hopefully we can create an approach here that the city council will, give some credence to, because I think it's a lot of good issues are being presented here, both policy and legally, and I hope a resolution we come up with today will have some strength moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Peters. Any questions for Tom? Vice Chair Stevenson.
Thank you. So I'd also like to say the goal of the bill, which is to increase the amount of available housing, is a really important one. So I'm glad that we're finding common ground, I think, in a way that's going to be able to move this forward. From the presentation, I found the data that smaller units are in high demand, really compelling. And as I've said before, I believe that there are equity issues that exist under our current system. So again, I think it's really important that that we do something here. As everyone else has said, I think the 2 units by right makes a lot of sense. You know, I've found that there's consensus around that much, at least, even among some folks that may have otherwise opposed the idea of the bill, you know, seem to at least agree on the idea of 2 units. So I think it's really important that we at least recommend that much. It sounds like we've got agreement here about that. Doing it across the board everywhere, you know, starts to address the equity concerns that I've raised, you know, as just like Tom says, the political issues with that as well. And, you know, that would double the amount of potential housing units overnight, which, you know, could be transformative. So I think that we need to at least do the 2 units by right. I think we have to talk a little bit about what the process for more units than that would look like. I think, you know, conditional by board has been suggested. I think that's a good suggestion. I would only point out, I think BMZA deferred to us on this bill. So I'd be curious if they would agree with that recommendation, because that would be, it would be putting some work on their plate. But I don't disagree that that's where it belongs. And the other thing I would point out is I think, you know, at least for new construction, we should consider, you know, recommending those parts of the bill as written, you know, with the increased density and even the bonus unit. You know, I think that that makes a lot of sense for new construction and modern architecture, in ways where it may be more of a challenge for conversions. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Stevenson. Are there any questions for Eric from the commission? Okay, I'll wrap it up with my thoughts. I first want to thank Councilman Dorsey for proposing the legislation. It was very thoughtfully prepared and presented to us on the 18th. And I personally appreciate the councilman's passion for this subject. I think he's advocating in all the right ways. I also want to thank the city residents and advocacy groups that weighed in, both in writing and in person during our last hearing. I am sure that whatever decision or whatever recommendation we make, hopefully whatever decision the council makes, is going to have certain people saying, oh no, and other people saying, oh yes. But hopefully everybody will look at the process that we've gone through and said it was fair and gave everybody an opportunity to comment. Throughout the process, I've had two major concerns, and I generally have these concerns regarding any housing policy as it relates to Baltimore City. The first is I want to make sure that, I think everybody wants to make sure that we maintain the stability of our existing neighborhoods, that nothing erodes the stability of our existing neighborhoods. I think when you look at Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance data and a lot of other, with Baltimore's data, a lot of other indicators, neighborhood stability is really essential for long-term growth for everybody in the city. So I want to make sure that we're not doing something that would potentially destabilize the neighborhood. Second, I don't want to take, speaking broadly here, I don't want to take our focus away from what I consider the major housing issue in Baltimore City to be, which is the vacancy problem. And solving the vacancy problem and the blight that is caused from the vacancy and the destability or instability that's created by vacancy throughout our city. So many people are working on that. I think that that's essential because that provides great opportunity for so many people. So those are my two major concerns coming into it. Since our hearing, Councilman Dorsey did provide us with his presentation, and in his presentation, as mentioned in his presentation, there was a great study by the University of California at Berkeley. There are others, Othering and Belonging Institute's zoning reform tracker. I spent a lot of time researching that, going through that, reading through all of the data specifics that they were providing, going through the list of all of the jurisdictions that they focused on, and they focused on there was about 125 total entries. Several of them were multiple entries from a single jurisdiction. They were all municipal. There was no states at this point in time. They're going to be continuing updating this zoning reform tracker. It was an incredibly helpful tool. And what I came to find out is a couple of things. And by the way, based on that, I also placed calls to the City of Durham Planning Department, the City of Raleigh Planning Department, the City of Charlotte Planning Department. I did speak with a planner from the City of Durham extensively about what they've done as identified in the tracker, and it was very, very helpful for me. But my conclusions from that analysis was there were a total of 78 different jurisdictions from Alaska to Wyoming that have proposed similar housing ordinances and policies that will one day become ordinances to what we're proposing, what has been proposed here. Of that 78, 55 or 77% or 70% focus on accessory dwelling units, what they call the granny flats and whatnot, which is one additional unit per home. The remaining 23 jurisdictions have adopted or are in the process of proposing legislation and adopting legislation that would propose 2 or more additional units for single-family conversions, what they call plexes, a 2-plex, a 3-plex, or a 4-plex. That many of those jurisdictions, and this is really, really important, many of the jurisdictions that if you go back to the tracker, you'll see they have tweaked their ordinances over time. They came out with an ordinance, they evaluated its performance, they saw where it's deficient, they came back and they made modification, introducing additional ordinances to solve those deficiencies or to address unintended consequences. And so we have to look at this, in my opinion, as a temporal measure. That it's a great first step. Let's not take too big of a first step. Let's take that first step. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how we can tweak it and modify it and provide additional opportunities and see their impact on the city. And then finally, one of the most important things that I saw in that data was that the vast majority of the jurisdictions that did have ADU and flex provisions were jurisdictions that were growing in population and had very little available land mass for additional housing, which is not necessarily the case in Baltimore. Population has been dwindling, and we do have land mass for new homes, our vacant lots, and whatnot. So I think those are four important kind of conclusions that I reached from the looking at the OBI data. So based on all of this, I believe that the Abundant Housing Act, while a great first step, probably goes too far in its current form. But I think as Vice Chair Stevenson stated on at the 18th, the status quo is not acceptable. And so we need to do something. I agree with that 100%. So here's what I'm going to suggest, okay? Number one, allow one accessory dwelling unit in every residential district in the city. The accessory dwelling unit would have to be accessory to an owner-occupied unit, an owner-occupied home. This would address, we heard a lot of testimony from care providers and talking about additional income and talking about generational wealth. This would address those comments, but it would also address the negative comments we heard regarding investor-only properties in neighborhoods, potentially creating instability. So recommendation number one would be to provide one accessory dwelling unit as a matter of right. It will be accessory to an owner-occupied home. And we can talk about some of the logistics after that. Number two would be to permit up to fourplex. So anywhere between 2 to 4 additional units in all residential districts as a conditional use by the board, not conditional use by ordinance, but conditional use by the board. Apply the same standards that were in the Abundant Housing Act, i.e. that you have to have so many square feet to have 2 units, you have to have so many square feet to have 3 units, and you have to have so many square feet to have 4 units. Require community input, especially council person input. And they have to be notified, and it has to be, and I think planning can do that very, very successfully as they staff the BMZA. But taking that out of the purview of condition by ordinance and putting it in the purview of condition by board with very specific criteria associated with it. And finally, my third recommendation will be to not abandon the existing parking requirements, but allow flexibility. One thing that was very clear in my conversations with the planner from Durham was that they did not change their parking standards. They were very concerned about parking in becoming a problem in neighborhoods, so they did not change it, but they allowed flexibility. The further in the core of Durham, so you were the more opportunity for on-street parking as permitted to address it. I think, for example, one of the things we may recommend would be, as Councilman Dorsey had said, to allow a bonus unit, you have to be within 750 feet of a transit, a grocery store, or a main street. Well, maybe we tweak that and say, I don't think we should allow the bonus unit as part of the Plex units. But maybe we use that same standard to allow parking variances, so parking waivers. That if you're within 750 feet of a transit stop or a grocery store or a main street, that you would you would be granted a waiver to parking, but not to completely eliminate parking throughout all residential zoning classifications. So that's where I stand. But I welcome any questions from the commission.
I have one question or a couple questions, Mr. Chair.
Please.
Just to clarify on the fourplex, was that 4 total units or 1 plus 4?
It was 4 total units.
4 total units. And that's consistent with the bill if you exclude the bonus unit, I believe.
Right.
And when you started to talk about parking, I became concerned about variances because I think variances are problematic. They're an administrative burden and they, you know, lend themselves to bias and things like that. But you sort of address that in identifying a specific criteria for said variances, such as the proximity to transit. And so I think that if we go that route, that criteria is important so that variances are never arbitrary, but applied, thoughtfully and equally across the board.
Other questions?
This is Chris Ryer. Just some points of information. A typical urban block, we'll call it a row house block in Baltimore, is 300 feet. To give you a sense of distance from a property to a transit station or a bus stop, for example, or a grocery store. I would ask Eric Tiso if there is a definition of grocery store in the zoning code.
Stand by. Let me search the code for that.
While Eric's looking at that, I know that Councilman Dorsey had included those three provisions in order to obtain the bonus unit. I'm suggesting that maybe those, and maybe more, maybe there's other things that, maybe a neighborhood has a bike share program or something else that would facilitate less demand for vehicles. But unfortunately, despite a lot of great efforts from a lot of great people, Baltimore is still a very vehicle-centered city. And I don't think, again, going back to the stability of the neighborhood concern or question, I'm just concerned about parking becoming a problem in the neighborhood, which therefore would provide some level of instability. We can come up with other criteria, is what I'm trying to say.
And to answer the question, groceries are not separately defined. They are included under retail goods establishment along with other uses. So when a term is not specifically defined in the code, then it's given the ordinary meaning as understood by the common person or typical dictionary definition.
Anything else you'd like to add, Chris?
No, but I thank Eric for that. That would be a challenge to interpret it, and I would invite you to look at other criteria if you're concerned about that. Main Street District does typically address all types of retail, so it might be likely to include a grocery store.
Right. I mean, again, the thought that behind this is, you're going to give a parking variance to a home that would potentially, house employees on that main street, right? Then you got people who are working on Main Street in any one of the shops or restaurants or whatever, and they can now walk to work or bike to work easily, comfortably, and therefore, you're providing that additional either accessory dwelling unit or plex unit to support that. And you really don't think you need it. And again, since it's in the since it would be within BMZAs, I think we can provide some criteria for that without being totally, sorry, I just got distracted, without being totally explanatory. And these are what create a variance, or this is what you would grant a variance, or this is what you would not. We just need to remain somewhat flexible. And by the way, I also recognize that, I think the owner occupancy accessory dwelling unit was important to address some of the concerns that were raised during the hearing. I recognize that that's going to be a challenge over time to fully administer, because I'm an owner, I build an accessory dwelling unit for a caregiver or for additional income. It's working out great. I decide to sell my unit. I sell it to somebody doesn't live there, who rents out now both units. And so how do I address that? Well, I mean, if the properties being maintained and everything like that. So that is kind of an enforcement issue that we would have to address, but that would happen under any circumstance.
The IRS can't do any better. All they could do is make you live there for 2 years.
Yeah, I would add, I did some very preliminary work. I called two well-known nonprofits in Baltimore, Neighborhood Housing Services and Healthy Neighborhoods, about mortgage products for owner occupants and accessory units, and both confirmed that the banks in the Baltimore region typically will not include the income from the accessory unit when they're underwriting the mortgage. And so that's a challenge to the affordability issue for the owner occupant. However, both expressed that those types of mortgages they believed were common in other cities, and suggested that our department may want to research lending in Boston, lending in New York, lending in other cities that allowed either all or part of the income from the accessory unit to be used to qualify for the mortgage. That would make the larger buildings more affordable for Baltimore residents or Baltimore owner occupants.
Director Ryer, this is Robin Allen. And Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please.
I thank you, Director Ryer, for addressing that, because as you know, I asked that question or a related question during the hearing, and then looked up some information with Live Baltimore, and I really do appreciate you addressing that. That was one of my, and still remains one of my concerns, because with the Ashburton issue 25 plus years ago, there was the concern that families that had moved there once the neighborhood had desegregated, because there's a deep history to that. I'll leave that alone for the moment. The parents who owned the properties were aging, and their grown children may or may not have been able to retain the properties. And we talk now a lot about generational wealth. They may have wanted to keep the properties, but access to the resources to do so may be a challenge. So that is what drove my question. It's not just the larger buildings, but also just regular homesteads, quote unquote, that people may want to hold on to and be able to provide housing for others, as well as generate some revenue and help pay the mortgages and keep those properties in their families, retain a legacy. So thank you very much for addressing that.
You bet. And again, I fully anticipate, based on all the work that was done by UC Berkeley, which was a great amount of work, that this is going to be an evolutionary process. It's not like, okay, we're done. We're going to adopt, the city council is going to adopt something, and then we're going to evaluate its performance, and then we're going to tweak it. They're going to tweak it and whatnot to maximize its success. And the planner from Durham said that very thing, and they're experiencing tremendous population growth in the Triangle area. So they've gone to some pretty extreme measures, which I don't think would be appropriate here. But
I'm struggling with the parking amendment a little bit. On the one hand, if we think of practical applications, some of the neighborhoods that it's hardest to find a parking space right now are some of the very same neighborhoods that are in demand and where we may want to increase housing, not increase cars, but increase housing. And so I worry on the one hand that this might take too many teeth out of the bill. On the other hand, if the variance is, framed correctly and widely enough, then it's going to speak exactly to those locations where folks don't need cars because they're close to transit or whatever the criteria are.
If I could
So-
add one point of information to your point, Commissioner, we could define the parking exception instead of for Main Street districts. After all, this is a zoning bill, we could define it around C1 or C2 zoning districts, which would broaden it out much more than, I think there are less than a dozen Main Street districts in the city. So that would establish a sort of perimeter of whatever the footage is around any C1, which is by definition a neighborhood commercial district, or C2.
So another thing to consider, and this just popped in my head, I live in a condominium, and some of the units in the condominium have one parking spot, and some of the units have two parking spots. Some of the people who have two parking spots only use one. And so they put their parking spot out to lease for those people who have one parking spot who need two. And maybe if somebody's looking to add an accessory dwelling unit in their block and whatnot, and they look at their neighbors and say, hey, can I lease that space, your extra space over there for you for blank dollars a month, and thereby providing it off-site. I didn't say that the parking has to be provided on-site. They said that they have to provide parking, they have to show parking, but they're providing parking, and maybe it's on-street parking. If it's not in a designated parking permit zone within the city, and they can show, hey, there's ample parking on the street, maybe that addresses it. So again, I'm just trying to remain flexible with it, but I think that total elimination of parking, again, just goes too far for me.
And I want to be conscious of going too far, because I really think it's important that, in the American spirit of politics, that we compromise and move forward on this. But couldn't or maybe shouldn't this be left to the consumer and the wisdom of the free market to decide? Like, if someone needs a car and there's not a parking space provided with the with the unit, then that unit's probably not going to be attractive, right? I just worry that leaving a parking loophole in there is just going to be used to prevent the bill. Or what about, do we view parking the same for a for an accessory dwelling unit as we do for the plexes? Because I agree that maybe we shouldn't throw all parking requirements out the window for the plexes, but I'm just concerned that if we say one ADU by right across the board, and we keep the parking requirement in there, it's not going to be still across the board, just because of different conditions in different neighborhoods, different geographies in different neighborhoods, back to lot sizes and things. It just makes me nervous.
I mean, I think maybe there's a good compromise there, Eric, in terms of, again, I don't want to throw the parking out entirely, but maybe there's an opportunity when you have an accessory dwelling unit, which is already going to be challenging from a cost standpoint and a mortgage standpoint and everything. If you throw the parking on there, maybe it does become just too prohibitive to really even do. Maybe we look at it and we say, okay, let's start off with no parking requirement for an ADU, for one ADU. But if you're going for a plex of 2 or 3 or 4, you have to provide some level of parking in accordance with the code. It doesn't have to be on site, but it has to be, and there are variances that can be granted based on X, Y, and Z. And we don't have to, I don't think we have to solve this specifically today. I think we need to make a recommendation to the council, and I'm sure Councilman Dorsey, might very well ask us our opinion on, okay, give me more meat on the parking issue or whatnot.
I'm much more comfortable with that if we no parking requirement for the ADU and but keep the parking requirement with specific variance criteria for the plexus.
One of the things that was also included in Durham, which I think might be a good idea for us to talk about, I don't think it may or may not have to be included in the legislation, would be kind of an annual report. The planning department provides an annual report to Durham, is both a city and a county. And they provide an annual report to the city county government that provides the data on, here's how many applications we had, here's where they are, addresses, a map, so on and so forth, that illustrates where things are happening. And so people can see, is it being effective? Is this addressing the issue? Maybe that's something that we can also include in the bill, that the planning department has to provide an annual report.
No objection.
All right, what are other people's thoughts, commissioners?
I wanted to get back to what you were talking about what happens in the future to these locations. Someone passes away, the family doesn't want to move in, they sell the property, the person who purchases it sees 2 units and thinks they're good to go. And they rent out the building completely. And then this becomes an enforcement issue if people care to enforce this. And I'm not sure how we go about that. So I'm wondering how we either characterize these kinds of units somehow in the property information or in the deed, or how do we make sure that that message gets delivered? Because I recently learned of someone who had bought a house and thought she was fine, and had, it was the young woman who came and talked about how she bought her house. She thought she was doing everything right.
Yep.
She had an apartment. She had it was registered appropriately. Come to find out, no. She was in a big mess because the building had been vacant before for enough times to lose the non-conforming use. So I'm just wondering, maybe it's not appropriate in this vehicle, but I'm just concerned going forward, if we want this to be successful, we want when these buildings change hands, we want people to understand what it is they're purchasing.
Yeah, I mean, it could be.
I did say a couple things in response to that, Commissioner Collins, because I agree with you. One, to the young lady who spoke the other day, this would address her specific issue. The idea of making that information more available to property purchasers, I think, is a good idea in and of itself. But to your original question about enforcement issue, candidly, I'm not sure that it would be an enforcement issue the way I see it, because I don't think that we would or would have the ability to take these units back once the property is no longer owner occupied. I think the catch would be that it would have to be owner occupied in order for them to make the conversion. So they would have to make the commitment of moving into the property for 2 years or whatever it is. But then once it's converted, I think that it would exist as 2 units. I don't know that there's an enforcement mechanism or a good, reason to be able to take that back.
Yeah, I don't know whether or not a deed restriction that would run with the land. So that if I'm converting a unit, converting my home and adding an ADU, I'm also voluntarily adding a restriction on that the owner must occupy the home in order to rent the unit. That goes in the record so that during a title search, during a transfer, that's brought up to the buyer's attention. Hey, did you know?
There's also the rental registration process, as you said, that I thought might be the appropriate mechanism.
Sure.
And so maybe I take my original answer back, Marcia, and say that it would be through the annual rental registration.
Yeah. Again, I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to, or does it make sense for us to work out the details? We are making a recommendation to the city council, and I think if we identify these things, they can look at them and they can say, yeah, the law department's going to have to weigh in, things like this, and I'm sure I'm going to be getting a dozen emails from people saying, the variance standards, how do we look at the variance standards for this? How do we create that unique hardship that rises to the level of a variance and so on and so forth for parking? And I don't think we're going to be able to hammer that out ourselves. But I think if we include the provisions that say these are really important to us as part of our recommendation to the council, then that's great. We're not going to, for example, we're not going to rewrite this bill. It's just not what I think we're been asked to do.
In other words, Mr. Chairman, because I was going to ask that question, we're not necessarily going to parse out specific amendments like we would typically do for other bills. We're going to express an approach. Is that?
I would suggest that if everybody's comfortable with that. Because otherwise, I think
Because
we can spend the next 4 hours.
yeah, that becomes a big job to actually craft these amendments.
And law department's going to have to do it. I'm sorry, Talib.
No, in terms of the approach, and several people talked about this, and even Councilman Dorsey talked about this whole, this being a wealth creation tool, particularly for people of color. And when I was concerned a little bit when Chris talked with Neighborhood Housing Services and Healthy Neighborhoods, really talking about the financing institutions not having the tools to finance this. And so I don't know how we state it as part of our approach, that they really need to look at this if it does get passed or recommended, that they rethink, coming up with some financing tools so that if owners want to create these additional units, that there is a mechanism for them to get financing. And if it's being done, if some of these banks are doing it in other areas, why can't they kind of sit together and really look at some solutions? So I just think we need to drive that, because that systems change. and we could pass this, but really the system isn't going to change in terms of wealth creation unless we push some people in terms of, particularly the banks, in terms of the financing. So wanted to just say that.
I think it's
Yeah, I think that's an interesting issue that we need to think about. I mean, I can't imagine this wouldn't be a lending opportunity for financial institutions. It's hard sometimes to get them to look at something new and see what's in it for them financially. But to me, it would seem like this would be an interesting expansion opportunity for lending arms, and maybe they would need some kind of a, I hate to use the word pilot, but some way to ease them into the concept.
If they're
Because
doing it other places, it could be as simple as the fact that it wasn't previously allowed here, which would make it a financial risk for them. So
yeah, okay.
opening the door for that. But I agree the conversation should be had.
Well,
Yeah,
I think it's also important over the last 7 years, 8 years, we've been talking about ways from an equity standpoint, and all the banks are saying, hey, yeah, we're in, we're in. Well, this is the perfect example or opportunity for them to really be in, right? Because now you're going to be able to say, okay, you really want to be in? Figure out a tool to have a mortgage for an owner-occupied unit to provide an ADU and allow the rent of that ADU to be incorporated into the mortgage. That's wealth creation for traditionally underserved communities in our city.
So I have a question getting back to the bill, and hopefully this is just a clarification. So if we limit the ADU to owner occupied units, what is the process to get more than one unit in a non-owner occupied?
So
Is that also too conditional by board?
yeah, if I'm an investor or if I'm an owner and I want to convert my home into 3 or 4 units, then I have to fill out the application with the BMZA. I have to go through the criteria that was currently in the bill, that I have to have 2,250 square feet for 3 units and 3,000
But
square
what
feet.
about for just 2? And the reason I ask is because, one of the arguments, and you started out, Mr. Chair, talking about vacant housing. One of the arguments is that this could help address vacant housing. So I want to make sure that by, if we limit it to owner occupied, that we're not precluding opportunity to, put 2 units for an investor to do 2 units in West Baltimore. In my neighborhood, just for example.
Okay, that's good.
And I just want to make sure that we're thinking about that.
No,
And so what would be the process for a non-owner occupied to do, the same 2 units as the owner occupied next door?
I think you were saying it would be a BMZA action, as would the parking waiver. So if you were an investor and you wanted to convert a vacant building to 2 or 3 or 4 units, you would go through the BMZA process. Is that correct, Sean?
yeah, I think that's the way to do it. Doesn't prohibit somebody from converting their home into 2 units and saying this is no longer an ADU, but now I have to comply with parking and I have to comply with these other standards. Does that make sense, Eric?
I understand. I want to, also keep in the front of our minds that this was a part of the reason that we selfishly wanted to address this is because the huge administrative burden of all these conditional by ordinance that we're coming across over and over. And this is, keeping that administrative burden, that administrative barrier in place. And I think we're saying that it's for good reason on the 3, 4 units so that the communities can have input. And my community specifically agrees with that, and a lot of folks that testified and wrote expressed that. So we're balancing a lot of things, and I just want us to remember we were also trying to balance the revitalization of vacant properties and making them more affordable to rehab without barriers. And so
At the end of the day, I'm sitting here looking at the chats from Councilman Dorsey, and at the end of the day, the owner occupancy requirement, he's saying may not be legally enforceable. I don't know whether or not I agree with that, but I respect his opinion. And if it's not legally enforceable, then the whole owner occupied ADU goes away, and you're right back into the mix of things, and you're just saying, okay, it's 2, 3, or 4 units, under BMTA rules.
Yeah, if I could speak to that, I do believe the councilman is correct. There really is a tough, very tough to define owner occupied. And I know we don't have a tool now. We probably all know we all use the SDAT data and the mail to information to guess whether a property is owner occupied or not, but it's not definitive. However, to your point, Commissioner Stevenson, the BMZA process is substantially shorter and the more shorter in terms of time and more predictable than the conditional use ordinance process. So it's not removing a process entirely, but it is providing a predictable and participatory process for converting anywhere from 2 to 4, whatever your number is, number of units.
All right, so
And I would assume, and the councilman can comment on this, but all the other regulations, the bulk regulations, the square footage regulations, there's no proposal to change any of them. So it's not like you could take a tiny 2-story row house to the BMZA for 4 units. You would still have the same spatial regulations that you have now.
But if we use the example of one of our R8 neighborhoods, which are the neighborhoods that have had the burden of these conversions in the past, the majority of these conversions in the past. All right, so now I have a different concern in light of whatever. I'm not looking at the chat, but if the owner occupied is not definable or not enforceable, then what should our?
If it's not, then I think we just fall back to 2, 3, and 4 additional units. Just 2, 3, and 4 additional units would be permitted under BMZA in accordance with the standards, but you have to provide parking.
Does that even do anything? Does that even change what we currently allow?
Yes, because does it change what we currently allow? Yes, because it's no longer conditioned by ordinance, it's conditioned by board. That would change that process entirely. It's not exactly what the councilman was asking for, because he was asking for this to be permitted as a matter of right, period. There was no BMZA or conditioned by ordinance on either of those. If you went in and you had X, Y, and Z, you were automatically by right given 4 units, and if you were quote 750 feet, you were given that potential bonus unit. So it's neither of those two. I still, personally would suggest that we analyze the ability whether or not, and I'm going to go back in and check the zoning reform tracker, and maybe reach out to UC Berkeley to see if there's any provisions for owner occupancy requirements in those, and if so, how do they do it? But again, we're making a recommendation to the council. So the recommendation is, if you have an owner occupied unit, if you're an owner, you want to create an ADU, you're permitted to do so as a matter of right, and you don't have to provide an additional parking space. You have to have a minimum of 1,500 square feet, and in order to do that, but otherwise you're permitted as a matter of right. If you want to create 2, 3, or 4 units where you're not the owner, it's an investment property, you have to have the square footage requirements, but now you also have to provide parking or seek a variance to parking based on some criteria, such as proximity to transit, proximity to a commercially zoned property, adequacy of parking on the streets, that you're not in a parking permit zone, so on and so forth. But that would be the differentiator. And if the owner occupancy falls out, then you say, okay, then it's just you're back to 2, 3, and 4 units by BMZA approval, but with parking on a certain standards.
I think the owner occupancy makes it messy.
I do think the chairman has a point around the parking issue. It's very definable. We can define, the distance to a transit line. We can define the distance to a C1 zoning district. And that would be a logical and legal reason for exempting a property from the parking requirement.
I agree with that.
And additionally, through the BMZA process, adjacent property owners are notified, right? Is that correct, Mr. Tiso?
No, adjacent property owners would see the posting that's required. And then we frequently alert community organizations and we recommend that the applicants speak with their adjacent property owners because they may not participate with those groups.
And does the current provisions require for BMZA require the city council person to be notified?
I don't believe there is a requirement, but I believe all the council members get notice of the agenda. We could verify that.
Again, I think I don't want to require somebody to have to get a conditional use by ordinance, but at the same time, I think it's unreasonable to presume that the city council is going to completely eliminate themselves from this discussion, since this stuff happens in their districts and they want to know about it and they want to, so they should be notified.
I'm pretty sure that council people regularly participate in the BMZA process.
Again, I think that's something that we can include in our recommendation to city council. I don't think we're going to be rewriting this bill. We're going to make recommendations on specifics and let them listen to what they want and disregard what they don't want. And any additional thoughts, questions, comments?
I guess I'm just want to clarify, slightly confused. If you're still saying the recommendation would still have something about owner occupancy in it, and if that's sort of not a criteria that we can use for zoning laws, then we probably shouldn't recommend it because it would make it confusing when the recommendation is considered by the council. So I just wanted to clear that up in your thoughts, or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
No, I mean, you are as confused as I am. So again, I still believe that that's an important, if the wish of this commission is to simplify it and say, eliminate the owner occupancy issue altogether. Let's make a recommendation that you're permitted 2, 3, or 4 units based on building size, so on and so forth. It's a BMZA issue now, no longer by right as a matter of right, and that you have to go through parking. You have to provide parking unless you're provided a variance with criteria that we can establish at some point in the future or as part of a bill rewrite. I'm fine with that. I don't think it goes as far as, so I'm fine with that.
My hope would be that our recommendation in that if we eliminate the owner occupied, that we're recommending 1 ADU by right, BMZA for
4? That's what I heard.
3.
no, sorry, now I realize the confusion because it's the total number of units or the additional number of units. So maybe I do agree with you, Mr. Chair. You were saying 2, 3, or 4 additional units, the 1 ADU for a total of 2 units by right. So we are on the same page. Thank you.
Okay, that clears it up for me as well.
I also agree that the simplest version, I have a general view that the zoning code is way too complicated as it is, and that the simplest version is going to be the best and the most legally supportable and the most equitable, because you don't necessarily have to hire a lawyer to understand what the rules are. And I know there are some details here, but something simple like what Mr. Stevenson just said, I think is more workable, and I would support that. And like it's why I don't also support the bonus unit concept. I mean, I understand the point of it, but it's complicated. And I like this notion that 1 is permitted and 2 through 4 are BMCA, and something that's simple and quantifiable like that for me works well.
All right, so let's step back because now I'm a little confused. I think there should be no more than 4 units in any home, owner occupied or non-owner occupied. So there is an existing dwelling. You can have an additional unit or 2 or 3, for a total of 2, 3, or 4 units in that home. Okay, because so that we're all on the same page. There's no more than 4 units in any given home.
Right.
If it's 3,000 square feet or greater.
There's no 5 scenario is what you're
There's
saying.
no 5 scenario, right? And that if we eliminate the owner occupancy requirement, that any additional unit, 2 units or 3 units would therefore have to go before the BMZA for approval under the standards that currently exist in the proposed bill as it's written. And that there's no by right unit anymore. You're not permitted anything by right. You have to go before the BMZA to get 1 unit approved, 2 units, or 3 units approved.
Now you lost me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. So I thought you were saying 2 units by right, 3 or 4 units by BMZA, with parking and other standards like bulk regulations go to the board. And here I'm unclear whether they go to the board period or whether the parking only goes to the board if it is within X feet of a transit line or a commercial area. But I thought I heard by right for 2, by board up to 4 total.
Okay. I'm fine with that. I think that, and let's see how it works out and let's monitor it, because one of the things I'm going to include is a requirement that planning department will prepare a report on ADU, an annual report on ADUs and flex units, be given to the commission and the council, analyzing this and ideally making recommendations on how we can tweak this. So based on that, what I'm hearing everybody say, well, what I'm hearing several people say, is that a property owner would be able to add 1 unit above the existing unit as a matter of right with no parking requirement. That should they add 2 or 3 additional units for a total of 3 or 4 total homes, they have to go before the BMZA. They have to meet the standards that are enumerated in the bill as 2250 or 3,000. They have to provide parking or seek a variance to the parking requirements if they were able to get the, they're within 750 feet, blah, 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 blah. Establish as many standards as we possibly can regarding that parking variance so that it is not ambiguous and different every time. Yes, I got 2 thumbs up from Vice Chair Stevenson. Liz, that makes sense to you?
That does make sense to me.
I agree with that. It's not what you said. I mean, it's a little, I hope it doesn't add confusion, but because it's a special use, they'll also have to meet the standard for a special use or conditional use under traditional standards in addition to the things you said. But I think that was built into the logic of your proposal.
They'll have to meet the BMZA standards.
The normal BMCA standard for conditional uses, yeah.
Yep.
And I'll note that the councilman put a comment in the chat saying that ADU is usually strictly referring to units attached from a primary structure. In this context, do you still mean to include it as a unit added to the interior of a conversion? So I guess that's an important,
Well, if we're
something
not
we need to consider
differentiating
or
on,
not.
if we're not differentiating on an ADU, we're just saying as a matter of right, you are permitted one additional unit on your property.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be accessory, doesn't have to be within the existing unit. It could be a completely separate. You're allowed one additional unit on your property. It could be over the garage. Well,
Yeah, so we just don't want to say, we don't
ADU.
want to say anything that, say ADU to make it sound like it's defined as one specific thing. That's all.
It would
Okay.
allow a tiny house in the backyard or something like that.
Right.
I think the distinction the councilman is looking for is that it would also allow the first floor apartment. It doesn't have to be part of a detached structure.
Right.
And I think we're all on the same page about that.
Yep.
Semantics, but important to be clear.
Okay.
I'm on board. Do we have to do a motion and such?
I think we do, but let's just run through, I don't know, did we lose to leave? I think, Robin, your thoughts on that proposal?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I'm good with that.
Okay.
I'm good with it. Thank you.
So as I see it, the motion would sound something like, we recommend that the Abundant Housing Act be modified to allow one additional unit as a matter of, in any residential zoning district, as a matter of right, with no additional parking requirements for that unit. That allowing two, or allowing 3 or 4 additional units, let's screw that, allowing 2 or 3 additional units, which would total 3 or 4 total units, would be permitted in all residential classifications as a conditional use by the board. And we would be applying the same standards as the Abundant Housing Act in terms of number of square feet required for number of units. And we would also require parking, that there would be specific variance standards created for parking variances. And that we would recommend that the Department of Planning work with all city agencies and in terms of developing or highlighting finance tools to promote additional units in owner occupied homes or in any home. And that planning will prepare an annual report of the additional units that have been developed under this code.
So moved.
Mr. Chair, I just got a message that Talib Horn's internet just went out.
Oh, no. It looked like he was in his office too. All right, well, I mean, we do have, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the commission here. So hopefully he'll be able to sign back in. But in his absence, did you make that motion, Vice Chair Stevenson?
I did.
Do we have a second?
Second.
For the motion that's been seconded, Mr. Secretary, will you call roll?
Certainly, Robin Allen,
Approve as amended.
Elizabeth Kuntz,
Approve as amended.
Marcia Collins,
Approve as amended. I think one of the troubles we run into is I think we should consider when this is written up that we state that a second unit by right, a third or fourth BMZA, right? Okay,
That's the way to put it.
thank you. So approve as amended.
all right, we have enough people without to leave, so I won't tell him to phone in. Tom Priebus,
Approve.
Eric Stevenson,
Approve.
and Sean Davis.
Approved. So the motion's been made, it's been seconded, it's been carried. That ends our business for this special hearing, special meeting. Is there anything for the good of the order from anyone?
I just
Just
want to
thanks,
thank everyone for all of their research. It's been a very impressive job by these commissioners. Thank you.
I would like to reiterate that. I'd also appreciate it if the if the department could keep us updated on, to the extent we don't read about it in the paper, but the progress of the bill and any other information that we learn as it goes along.
I agree.
Certainly, if it moves in council, we can always include that as a briefing session later.
Great, and Eric, since you are, Eric Tiso, since you are the one who officially writes this up, when you write up this motion, I guess we will see it in our minutes for approval on the June 8th meeting, correct?
Yes, though I'm going to take a shot at this and circulate it separately just to make sure that I encapsulated everything. I believe I have it correct, but I just want to verify that what we send is what you intended.
Perfect. I would appreciate that very much. If there's no other comments or questions or anything, move to adjourn our meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.